Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is nice to be able to be back in the sanctuary here and be able to speak to you through our online service here and be able to connect to you in this way. I just wanted to be able to give some thoughts about Pinchas before Shabbat began today. I think it's so important to be able to speak about this Parsha at this exact moment when we are in such a difficult period right now, when we feel like giving up, when we feel leaderless right now, when we feel like we are kind of roving a long time without a rudder. Parshat Pinchas comes in and gives us an orientation and pushes us forward. There are really two interesting parts I find about this Parsha. One is, of course, the story of Pinchas. Pinchas, which is, at first glance, really a hard story to interpret. Basically, there seems to be a bunch of Israelite men who are engaging in sexual acts with these Midianite women, who are then pushing them through this sexual act to worship Baal Peor, which was an idol at the time. We'll get into that a little later. And they would do that, and this was, of course, very much forbidden. And the idea was that so that the Midianite women would seduce the Jewish men, so that the Israelite people would fall, and that the Midianite people would actually be, and also the Moabites would actually be able to conquer the Jewish people. And this, of course, was the famous Bilam's plan, Bilam the prophet's plan, after he failed to curse the Jewish people and only could bless them in the previous Parsha. He figured that this was the best way to have the Jewish people fall, which is through their own sins, which so much of the time as Jewish people, that is how we fall. It's through our own sins. It's not through enemies outside. It's through our own sins a lot of the time. But of course, how does this end? All of a sudden, Zimri and Cusby, an Israelite and a Midianite woman, engage in a sexual act in front of the tent of meeting, and Moshe falls down on his face crying. He doesn't know what to do. They're doing this act not in private, but in public, in front of the whole entire community. Imagine if this was in front of the White House or something like that, if it was in front of the Lincoln Memorial for us. This was in front of the tent of meeting, all the more so the place where God's presence dwells in front of the whole Jewish community. This would have been the utmost act of rebellion that one can do, not just because he's violating the sin, but because he's showing his absolute disregard for Moses' authority and for God's authority. So this is really a great act of rebellion. And what we know is that this sin is forbidden by death because it's going to lead into worship of Baal Peor. And just so we understand what worshiping Baal Peor is, it's literally going to the bathroom next to the god. That is actually the way that Baal Peor was worshipped, is that you go to the bathroom next to the idol. And this is what the Israelites were engaging in, and they were seduced to it by this relationship with the Midianite women. And this, of course, was a plan to bring down the Jewish people. And in, of course, comes Pinchas to kill Zimri and Cusby. He gets up and spears them. And this is an act, of course, of zealotry. This is an act where someone gets up and does something. No one really seemed to ask him to do that. And he gets up and does this. And what's interesting at this moment that we have to note is that Moshe is fallen. Moshe is crying at this point. Moshe has basically given up. And the question that's brought up a lot, I think people are very uncomfortable with the fact, is Pinchas then is given a covenant of shalom. Right? You might think, Pinchas is being a zealot. He just killed all these people. Pinchas is then given a covenant of peace. How ironic. Right? He's giving an eternal covenant of peace by God. So what's the deal with that? How can Pinchas be given this eternal covenant of peace when he did such a violent act? And it's very hard for us moderns because, of course, we are against zealotry. We're against killings for religious reasons. Let me put that out right up there. But yet, the Torah seems to praise Pinchas' actions. So we can't necessarily disagree with God. So we have to figure out a reason, what was so amazing about what Pinchas did? Well, I think in order to really understand that, we have to understand more about the wider context of what is happening. As I said, the act that they were doing, Zimri and Cusby, was a known act that was punishable by death. So their punishment would be death, right? And it was a great act of rebellion against Moses' authority. It was a great act against the whole people. And if you look back further in the Parsha, actually before the previous Parsha is Parshat Bilam Balak, the story, and which is actually a story in which the Jewish people are kind of the side character. Really, the main characters are Bilam and Balak, and Bilam trying to prophesize or curse the Jewish people for the Moabite king Balak. And then the Parsha before that is Parshat Hukat. And if you actually Parshat Hukat, a lot of things happen in. But one of the most important things that happens in Parshat Hukat is the well of Mei Meribah, the well in which Moses lost his ability to enter the land of Israel. This was a place where, again, the Jewish people were complaining for lack of water, and God tells Moses to hit the well, to speak to the well, and Moses instead hits the well. He doesn't necessarily follow, and he says, you rebels, you Israelites, I'm kind of done with you. And he hits the rock, and of course water comes gushing out to feed and to give drink to the Jewish people. But God then says to Moses afterwards, you shall no longer be able to enter the land of Israel, because you disregarded my authority here. And not only that, but your brother Aaron is going to die. And what happens almost immediately after that is Aaron, his brother, dies. It's this horrible thing that Aaron dies immediately after. So you can imagine the amount of guilt, the amount of grief that Moses has at this moment. He is told that he will not lead the Jewish people into Eretz Israel. And you could really imagine what that must feel like. That Moses is like, this is my whole life. And what is there anymore? Do I even trust this people anymore, that this people led me into such a bad place? And finally, it gets to but of course the story goes on, and there are a couple of wars, there's some things that happen, there's some successes. Moses says, maybe we can keep going. He fights Og Melech HaBashan, he fights a great king, they have a victory. Maybe we can keep going, maybe I can convince God, even though God told me I'm not going into Eretz Israel anymore. And then we finally get into our Parsha, where the second after Bilam says, Ma tov ohalecha, ma tovu ohalech Yaakov. The second Bilam says, how good are these tents? How good is this nation? How beautiful is this nation? If my destiny was with them. Right? The second that happens after that, what do the Jewish people do? They fall into the clutches of the Midianite women, and they have these forbidden sexual relationships that end up literally equaling them going to the bathroom in front of gods, in front of idols, in order to worship them. It's so demeaning. Really? That's the Jewish people in which Bilam said, Ma tovu alecha Yaakov mishkatecha Yisrael? How good are your tents, O Jacob, Israel? Really? This is the nation that Bilam said he would do anything to be a part of? This is the nation that God loves so much? And now they're literally going to the bathroom in front of God, in front of idols? And literally at this point, Moses is ready to give up. He says, I'm never going to fix this. I'm never going to make it into Eretz Israel. This people's not, I'm giving up. I'm done. I'm not worth it. And all of a sudden, the Jewish people found themselves leaderless. Not only was Cozbi and Zimri doing this act, this capital, horrible act in which was a capital sin at the time, that you were liable for the death penalty for, but they were doing it while Moses was on the ground crying. Aaron HaKohen had died. Miriam had died at this point, and Moses, so his brother and his sister had passed away, and Moses was on the ground. He was promised that he was no longer going to be able to enter the land of Israel, and it looked like Moses had completely given up. The Jewish people were leaderless at this time. And what happens when the leader is, when a people's leaderless? Everyone gives up. Everyone says everyone's going to do, especially when you see the majority of people going about and doing these horrible things. Most people just give up and say, even if you think what most people are doing is wrong, because there's no leader, you're going to say, well, I'm going to go back to my house. I'm going to hide for a while. I'm going to be alone. I'm not going to do anything. But instead, we have Pinchas. Pinchas, who stands up and kind of saves the day by killing Cozbi and Zimri, which independently in the act is a very violent act and makes us kind of sick as Jews because we don't like violence. Right? But God tells him, because of that, he gets a brit shalom. He's created peace. Right? Because we're actually told that the punishing plague that was coming, because that the Jewish people were engaging in these sexual acts and worshiping Baal Peorah, has now been ended because Pinchas did judgment. right? Because Pinchas did what he did in this world. And what we're told by our Kabbalists and Hasidic Rebbeim is that those who do judgment in this world, if human beings endeavor to create a just world in this world, then God doesn't need to do it in the above world. Meaning that if people just step back and say, you know what, let this all work itself out, I'm not going to try to create justice, I'm not going to try to fight for anything, it just seems too hard, there's no good leaders to work with, it's not working correctly, I'm just going to give up. What are we told? Then God punishes us. Then we get a plague. Then we get something. Then somehow God has to create judgment by punishing the evildoers, and everybody ends up suffering. What the Hasidic and Kabbalistic rabbis actually say is that what's better is that if human beings judge themselves first, if human beings work to endeavor to create justice in their own world, then God doesn't need to do that. God doesn't need to do the punishing. God can just be a lover. God can just be a supporter. Right? If we can create our own human justice in the world, then God doesn't need to do that necessarily. Right? And it's much better. That's what God wants us to do, is to make a just world, is to create a just world, is for none of us to give up on creating a just world around us. And I think that is such an important lesson, and it's very hard to create a just world. It's especially when we feel that we are living in a leaderless time, and right now, God forbid to compare Moses to our president or to the government or whatever it may be, we are feeling leaderless. We're feeling in a time where we live in absolute chaos, where there's a pandemic outside, where no one knows if there's even going to be school, right? Everybody's kind of worrying about themselves right now. And it's a very, very difficult time, and we don't have leadership from coming up from above, whatever your politics, who are really giving us any sense of where we're going with this, who are giving any sense of security with this. We don't seem to have a plan. It's a very, very difficult time right now. And I think it can be easily what can happen, I think many people are doing, is I'm going to just be by myself. I'm not going to go anywhere outside of my family. I'm just going to seclude in and just make sure I get by in this hard time. And I can understand how you feel that way. And that's the way many people react when when it seems like we don't have a leader, when it seems like no one is helping out, right? Then I'm not going to help out. Then I'm not going to fight for justice. But what Pinchas is about, what this Parsha is about, is that one person who steps up and says, absolutely not. It's not going to end here. I'm not going to let it get me down that we seem leaderless at the time. I'm going to make sure that there's justice, even though it's difficult, even though it's hard, even though it's not pleasant, even though it requires inner grit. It requires kishkas to step up and not be afraid, but to try to create justice in this world and work tirelessly to make this world a better place. Even though it's harder than ever right now, we still must do it. And if we do that, we're promised that we'll get a brit shalom. We promise we'll get a covenant of peace. And not only that, but the Kabbalists say, the great Kabbalists, the great Jewish mystics of our faith, have said that the reincarnation of Pinchas is connected to Elijah the prophet, who is also swept up to God in a cloud later. And Elijah, of course, is known to stand up against Ahab and Jezebel, who were sacrificing to Baal. And at one point, Elijah was up against 300 prophets of Baal and the Israelite king. He was all alone, and Elijah had to made this sacrifice. He stood up unafraid, and of course, he ends up winning out with his amazing sacrifice. And the 300 prophets of Baal are taken away. And because of Elijah's zealousness, he's able to turn the tide and cause Ahab and Jezebel's downfall and represent the Jewish people. And we're told that by spirit, he is a reincarnation of Pinchas. And what we know about Elijah is that Elijah is alive in every generation. I know with the Jewish people, everyone knows you put out a cup for Elijah at your Passover Seder, right? To say that Elijah is going to come and drink that cup in every single generation. And not only that, that with the spirit of Elijah, when Elijah comes, we know that redemption is near. And what that should resemble to us, that the independent actions of someone who steps up and says, I'm not going to let this go, that I'm going to create justice no matter what, that I'm going to step up and work as a community to try to make this world a better place, to try to create justice in this world, even when it's difficult, and even when it's hard, and even when it seems like it's such an uphill battle. That spirit that Pinchas spirit, that spirit that says, I'm not going to give up, that Elijah's spirit, which is in every single person, we have that deep within us. If we set that aflame, if we're able to use that, then we can cause redemption to come. Right? And I think the way we can take this message of this Parshat in right now is to not just sequester ourselves alone. Of course, take care of your health and everything like that. Of course. Right? Wear a mask. Be socially distant. All those things. But we're in it together. We can't give up on creating community. We can't give up on making sure that everybody's okay. It's not that I'm the only one okay. We have to make sure that everyone's able to eat, that everyone in our society is healthy. And even though we feel like we have a dearth of leadership from above that is having us just sit here and the numbers just keep climbing in our country, like unbelievable how irresponsible that this country has handled this conflict. Even though that each individual can cause a change, each individual by wearing a mask, by staying socially distant, by making sure to help food banks, by making sure people get food, by talking to people, by being in community with people, whether that's digitally or in whatever way you possibly can, by supporting local businesses, by trying to support making sure health protocols are followed in our neighborhood, by pushing forward every so little bit to make sure that we can have a plan in place eventually, that our school children are safe in schools, that the teachers are safe in schools, that health is put forth first over money. That is so hard right now. There's every force against that right now. Every force in this country seems to be pushing against this. It seems like it's chaos right now. But if we cannot give up, even though it's difficult this time, even though we're suffering right now, even though everything seems to be falling around us, if we, especially as a Jewish community, come up and fight for justice for all peoples, that everyone is created, that everyone can be equal here, and that we can all fight to create a godly place in this world, then we could truly create a better world. And I want to underline again and again, I'm not saying to go out and do vigilante violence. God forbid. I'm not saying copy Pinchas' actions, exactly what he did and spear someone. God forbid. Right? But I'm saying the inner grit that Pinchas had to make sure that justice was followed, even in a time with a dearth of leadership, to become the leader, to become the spirit of the people at that time. That's what we need to tap into. We all need to lead at this time. We need to lead our families. We need to lead our communities. We need to create justice in our place. We have another police panel on Tuesday in Middletown to make sure we create racial justice here. I say to myself, what am I doing as a rabbi? I'm trying to create stop police brutality in my neighborhood. What do I know about that? I'm just a rabbi. I went to seminary. But I have to step up and help my neighbors. When my neighbor's in trouble, I have to step up. I have to learn about that. And even though it's hard and even though it's difficult, I have to help. I have to come up and listen. I have to come and work together with police and with people of color and of people of all different ethnicities to create a better union in this country, a more fair and equal place, and work to create justice even when it's difficult and even when we feel leaderless. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.